The morning I'm going to tell you about, I was standing at the ridge threshold in the grey before first light, and Petra was sitting pressed against my left knee, the way she only did when something had already decided she didn't need to be afraid. The trees were still. Not quiet the way trees are when nothing is happening, but still the way they get when something very large has recently passed through and the forest is holding what it knows. I'd been a backcountry ranger for 18 years. I knew the difference. I need to go back to the week before that morning to explain what it meant and why I haven't told anyone the full version of it until now. If you've spent any time carrying a grief that's settled into routine, you already know some of what I'm about to describe. Not the strange parts. Just the part where the loss stops being an event and becomes a condition, the same as a bad knee or a narrow road. That's where I was that November, and I want to be honest about it before anything else. I'd been a ranger in the high country sector for long enough that my name was on the emergency protocol binders in 3 district offices, and I'd never once thought about leaving. The work suited me. I was good at being alone in places most people found frightening, and I was careful in the way that careful men get after they've seen what happens when someone else isn't. My partner Dale had been that kind of man too, which is probably why it never occurred to either of us that a slide could come off the upper ridge on a clear sky morning in January. Without any warning, any instrument would have caught in time. That was 2 winters back. He was 54 years old. We'd worked the same sector for 11 years. I didn't go back to the upper ridge for 4 months after the recovery. When I did go back, I brought a thermos, olive green, steel-sided, scratched at the shoulder where it had been in my pack for a decade. I poured half the coffee into the cup for myself and left the rest on the stone marker the trail crew had set at the base of the slope, above where the slide had stopped. I don't know why I left it. It wasn't a decision exactly, more like the behavior of a man who was still having mornings and needed somewhere to put them. The next time I went up, I left the thermos again. Then it became the thing I did. I want to be clear about what I am. I'm not a superstitious person. I grew up practical, stayed practical, and 30 years of working in the mountains had given me exactly 0 patience for the kind of stories people tell when they want the dark to mean something instead of just being dark. I mention this because what I'm about to describe happened to a man with that specific background, and I think that matters. The last person in that district who would have invented this was me. November in the high sector comes down hard and fast. By the 20th of the month, the upper trail system is generally closed to all recreational traffic. The patrol schedule drops to weekly minimum checks, and the seasonal staff have been off the payroll for 6 weeks. What's left is the skeleton crew and the season close work, which means inventory, winterization checks on the trail infrastructure, and the last snow patrol before the access road gets gated. I was 58 years old that November, and I had been thinking in the vague, unfocused way of a man who is tired, but can't name the specific thing he's tired of, about whether the coming season would be my last. My supervisor, Gus, had asked me twice in the previous year if I wanted to move to a desk posting. I'd said no both times without really thinking about it. It was the kind of no that comes out of habit rather than intention. No one else was left to take the last patrol. There was a newer ranger, Callum, who had the skills for it, but his wife had just had their second child, and Gus wasn't going to ask him to spend 3 days in the backcountry in late November for what was essentially a formality. So it fell to me the way things do when you've been around long enough that you've become the default. I said yes, I didn't mind. The mountain in November, before the snow gets serious, has a particular quality I've always found easier to be inside of than the inside of my house. I packed for 3 days, the standard kit, emergency gear, the bear canister with food for myself and Petra, my field notebook, and the thermos. We drove the access road in my truck and left it at the trailhead before 6 in the morning, the kind of grey seam dawn that's more absence of dark than presence of light. Petra was 11 years old that November, which is old for a working dog on mountain terrain. She moved slower than she used to, and she'd stopped chasing anything. But she still read the trail the way she always had, her nose carrying information at a register I couldn't access, her body language the clearest early warning system I'd ever worked alongside. When she was relaxed, I was relaxed. It was that simple, and I trusted it the way you trust a clinometer when you're worried about slope angle. The first day was routine. We covered the south-facing switchbacks, checked the water bar drainage on the lower trail, confirmed the 3 trail marker posts that the September work party had flagged as needing replacement, and made camp in the patrol cabin at the 4-mile mark before the light went. The cabin is a 16-foot square structure with a small wood stove, 2 bunks, and a window that faces north toward the ridge. It smells like creosote and old wool. I'd slept in it probably 40 times over 18 years, including once with Dale when a storm came through faster than forecasted, and we'd been half a mile from the door when the wind started. That night, the first night of the patrol, I built the fire up and ate alone and tried not to think about which bunk he used to take. The north switchback was about a quarter mile past the cabin, up a section of trail that gained elevation quickly through a stand of old-growth hemlock. That's where Petra stopped on the afternoon of day 1. She didn't bark, she didn't crouch or show her teeth, or do any of the things a dog does when something feels wrong. She just stopped walking and stood with her nose lifted into the cold air coming down from the upper slope, and her tail, which normally swung loose when she was at ease, hung completely still. Not tucked, just held. I stopped with her and waited. I looked up the slope where she was reading into the hemlock shadows and the grey-green light coming through the canopy, and I saw nothing I could put a name to. After maybe a minute, she lowered her head and walked on. I stood there another moment and then followed. My first thought was deer. There had been a small herd working the upper slope that fall, and the scent of a large animal coming down on cold air is not unusual at that elevation in November. I wrote it in the field notebook. Petra reacted, north switchback, upper hemlock, 14:30 approximately. Deer or elk likely, and that was enough. I closed the notebook and didn't think about it again until the next morning. Day 2 began clear and cold, the kind of cold that has a flat quality to it. No wind, just temperature lying against everything like a weight. I left the cabin at first light with Petra and headed north toward the section of trail I'd marked in my fall assessment as requiring the most attention. There was a deadfall across the upper switchback, about a quarter mile above the hemlock stand, a big silver fir that had come down across the tread sometime between my October check and the first hard frost. I had flagged it on my report as an impassable obstruction and noted it would need a 2-person saw crew in the spring. You don't move a tree that size alone, and you certainly don't try it in late November. I came around the last bend above the hemlock stand and stopped walking. The tree was gone. Not gone as in someone had hauled it out, because that wasn't possible on that trail with that equipment. Gone as in cleared. The trunk had been moved off the tread and set back into the slope timber with the kind of force that would have required either heavy mechanical equipment, which could not have reached that point on that trail, or something I did not have a category for. The trail surface where the tree had lain was scraped down to mineral soil. The root ball was sitting 30 feet downslope, tipped on its side, the root mass still clotted with dirt the way it would be if it had been physically lifted and set down. I stood at the edge of the cleared section for a while. Then I walked it. I measured the disturbed area with my pace count. About 60 feet of cleared tread, the log itself maybe 70 feet of trunk in two rough sections, as if it had been broken by pressure rather than cut. The bark on the breakpoints was splintered inward, not outward. I have handled enough fallen timber to know what a saw does and what a splitting force does. This was the second one. I wrote it in the notebook. Then I stood there and I thought about who might have done it. My first explanation was a trail crew. It was possible, barely, that Gus had sent someone up ahead of my patrol to clear the worst of the obstructions. It was unusual, because we didn't starve trail work in late November, but not impossible. I took out my radio and raised the district office on the first try. The woman who answered was a seasonal admin finishing out her last 2 weeks before the winter layoff. I asked her to check whether any work order had been issued for the upper switchback section in the past week. She put me on hold for a few minutes and came back. "Nothing, Roy, no work order. You want me to check with Gus?" "No," I said. "It's okay, probably just the storm that came through last week shifting some debris." I turned the radio off and looked at the cleared trail and thought about the storm that had come through the previous week, which had been a light overnight system with maybe 4 inches of new snow and winds that didn't exceed 30 miles an hour at the ridge. Storms don't pick up a silver fir and set it down slope root ball first. I knew that before I said it, and the woman at the district office knew I knew that, and probably neither of us wanted to say the other thing. I kept moving. The rest of Day 2's route took me up past the cleared section and along the upper traverse toward Dale's marker. I arrived at the marker around mid-afternoon, about half an hour later than I'd planned, because I'd spent extra time at the deadfall site. The marker is a flat-topped stone about knee height set by the trail crew the previous spring, positioned where you can see both the upper ridge and the valley below if the weather's clear. That day, the weather was clear. I unzipped the top of my pack and took out the thermos. It was already on the stone. I stood there with my hand inside the pack, reaching for something that wasn't there, and I looked at what was sitting on the flat top of the marker, and I worked through the sequence very carefully. I had put the thermos in my pack that morning at the cabin. I had put it in the front cargo pocket, the same place it always rode, and I had zipped it closed. I remembered the specific sound of the zipper because the pull had been sticking slightly and I'd had to work it twice. The thermos was on the stone. The olive green thermos, scratched at the shoulder, stopper replaced, was sitting on Dale's marker in the afternoon light, with a quality of having been placed deliberately, the way you place something you understand the purpose of. I set my pack down and sat down beside it on the cold ground, and I put my hand on the thermos. It was warm. Not hot, not freshly poured, but the kind of warmth that lingers in insulated steel when the liquid inside is still above outside temperature and the air is cold enough to make the contrast notable. Whatever was in it had been poured recently enough that the warmth hadn't bled all the way through. Petra sat down beside me. She wasn't watching the tree line the way she does when she's alert to something. She was relaxed, her legs folded under her, her breathing slow. That's the part I came back to later. If something had been threatening, she would have known first, and I would have known from her. She was not afraid. I unscrewed the stopper. The thermos was full of coffee. Black. The same as I make it, because I have only ever owned one way to make coffee and it is without anything added. I sat at Dale's marker for a long time with the warm thermos in my hands and the cold air on my face, and the valley laid out 3,000 feet below me, and I didn't try to explain it anymore. The rational explanations had used themselves up. What I had instead was the specific sensation of having been watched for long enough that someone, something, knew the shape of what I did up here and had decided to answer it. I'm not going to tell you I wasn't afraid. I was, a little, the way you're afraid of something very large that is also very deliberate. But under the fear, or maybe running alongside it, was something else entirely. Something I didn't have a word for until much later. I poured about half the coffee into the thermos cup and drank it slowly. I left the rest on the stone. I got up, shouldered my pack, and walked back down to the patrol cabin in the last hour of light. And I didn't tell Petra what I was thinking, because she already knew. That night, I sat by the wood stove for a long time. The fire needed feeding every 40 minutes or so, and I let the task of that carry me through the dark hours. Outside the north-facing window, the ridge was a line of black against the cold stars, and I sat and watched it the way a man watches something he's stopped pretending isn't there. I should say something about Dale. Not a long accounting, because the story of who he was belongs to the people who loved him most. His sister Carol, his daughter who was in college when he died and is finishing her first job now, and it's not mine to inventory. What I can tell you is that he was the kind of partner you build 18 years of backcountry work around without fully understanding how load-bearing the relationship is until it's gone. He was precise about wind direction and casual about everything else. He had a way of talking through a hard situation that made the hard part feel like a mechanical problem, which is the most useful quality imaginable in a backcountry emergency, and also, I realized later, exactly the quality that makes the absence hardest to absorb. There was no one left to think alongside. The problems were still mechanical. I just had to solve them in quiet. The thermos ritual was not something I'd planned. It rose out of the first time I went back to the marker, that April after the recovery, when I stood at the stone with nowhere to put the fact of the morning, and the coffee was the only thing I had. I didn't think of it as ceremony. It was just where the grief went when it needed to go somewhere specific. I had been doing it for almost 2 years, when whatever was in the high timber noticed it. I slept in pieces that night, the way you sleep when something is working behind the surface of your thoughts. Petra slept through. At some point around 4 in the morning, I woke up and lay still in the bunk and listened to the cabin make its cold night sounds, the tick of the wood stove settling, the particular hiss of wind finding a gap in the north wall chinking. And I decided I was going to walk out to the ridge threshold at first light and see what I could see. I want to be careful here about how I tell this part, because I have gone over it a lot of times since then, and I don't want to make it into something it wasn't. I am not a person who embroiders. What I saw, I will describe as accurately as I can, and what I felt, I will describe as behavior rather than declaration, because that's the only register I trust myself to report in. I was out the cabin door before first light with Petra at my heel, moving up the trail in the dark with my headlamp on its lowest setting. The temperature was somewhere around 18 degrees. My breath came out in long, steady columns, and I could hear the creak of frost in the upper hemlock boughs and the particular quality of compressed snow under a boot that tells you how deep the cold has gone into the ground. I moved slowly, not because I was trying to be quiet, particularly though I was, but because the trail at that hour in that temperature asks for careful steps. At the north switchback, Petra stopped exactly where she'd stopped the day before, but this time she didn't just stand still. She sat down and pressed herself against my left knee, the way she does when she has made a decision about something. Her breathing was even. Her ears were forward, not back. I put my hand on her head for a moment, and she didn't move. I turned off the headlamp. The ridge was coming light, the sky behind the peaks going from black to the particular deep blue that precedes grey in November at this elevation. And in that between light, the tree line above the switchback was visible as a dark mass against the slightly lighter sky. I stood still and let my eyes adjust. Petra didn't move. My heart was doing something deliberate in my chest, not racing, just heavy and measured, and I was aware of my own breathing in a way I am not usually aware of it. Then I saw it. It was standing at the upper edge of the cleared trail section where the tread meets the timber on the north slope, and it was standing still enough that for a moment I thought I was making a shape out of shadow. The scale of it resolved first. 8 feet, maybe a little more, broad through the shoulders in a way that made the hemlock trunks behind it look like ordinary vertical lines rather than the large trees they were. Dark-coated, dark enough that in the low light it was mostly a mass of darkness, with a quality of being contained, deliberate, upright. It was not moving. It was looking at me. I know that sounds like something I'm inferring, and in part I am, because the light was low and the distance was maybe 40 yards, and I am being as precise as I can be about what I can and cannot verify. What I can verify is that its posture was oriented in my direction, and that there was a quality to its stillness that was different from the stillness of something that does not know you're there. The difference is one any tracker or hunting person knows. The held quality of deliberate attention is a different thing from the absence of motion. This was the held quality. We stood like that for long enough that I stopped trying to measure it. Petra made no sound. She stayed pressed against my knee, and her body was completely relaxed under my hand. And that is the detail that mattered most to me in the moment, and has mattered most to me since. 11 years of working that terrain with that dog, and I knew the texture of her fear and the texture of her ease as well as I knew the texture of my own. She was at ease. The creature, whatever it was, did not move toward me and did not move away. It stood at the threshold where the cleared trail met the timber, and it held its position. After a long moment, it shifted its weight, a slow, deliberate movement, not a flinch or a startle, more like a person settling their stance. And as the light continued to come up, I could see it more clearly. The face was set forward, the brow heavy, the eyes catching what little light there was in a way that made them briefly legible. Not threatening, not blank, the way animal eyes can be blank when they're reading a threat. Something else. Something I have turned over many times and still cannot put into precise language, which is unusual for me. What I will say is that it had already done what it came to do. I understood that, standing there in the 18-degree dark with my hand on Petra's head, and the ridge coming light above me, the thermos on the marker, the trail cleared before my feet reached it. 2 days of watching before deciding I was safe to look at directly. Whatever it had decided about me, it had decided before that moment. The moment itself was not the act. The moment was the acknowledgement. I did not speak. I don't know that I could have, and I wouldn't have known what to say if I could. The creature held its stillness for another long span, and then it turned, with the same slow deliberateness it had used to shift its weight, and it moved back into the timber. It did not crash or break through undergrowth. The hemlock absorbed it the way the hemlock absorbs everything, quietly, as if nothing had disturbed the arrangement of trees. Within a few seconds, the tree line was just a tree line again. Petra let out a slow breath and leaned against my knee for a moment, and then stood up and shook herself. And that was that. I stood at the north switchback for a while longer. The light was coming properly by then, grey and flat and honest. The ridge was visible. The trail ahead of me was clear. I'm not a person who has words for certain kinds of things. I've known that about myself for a long time. What I felt standing there was not a thing I could have reported to Gus. Not because it was strange, though it was, but because the vocabulary for it sits outside the register I use for most of my life. The closest I can come to it is this. I had been carrying a weight for 2 years that I'd stopped noticing the way you stop noticing an ache when it becomes permanent. And standing at that switchback in the November dawn, I felt it shift. Not lift, because grief doesn't lift cleanly. Not in my experience. But shift, the way a load shifts when someone puts a hand under it from the other side. Someone had noticed the thermos. Someone had noticed what it meant as precisely as another person would have had to know me well to notice. And they had answered it in the only way that matched it exactly. Not comfort, not condolence. A cup filled. The ritual continued. As if Dale's absence was known, and as if the mornings where I brought the thermos up the mountain were not something I did alone. I descended by a different route, the Eastern Traverse, which takes longer but has better footing in early frost conditions. I reached the trailhead by early afternoon. I loaded Petra into the truck and sat in the cab for a while with the heater running before I started the engine. Then I drove back to the district. I filed a patrol report that afternoon. Trail condition assessment, water bar drainage notes, marker posts confirmed, deadfall section cleared, cause unknown, no signage of mechanical access, recommend spring follow-up assessment. 5 sentences about the deadfall. Nothing about the thermos, nothing about the morning at the switchback. I read it over once and signed it and left it in Gus's inbox. I have thought about that choice many times. I don't regret it. What I saw at the ridge threshold was not a reportable event in any framework the district uses, and putting it into that language would have done nothing except produce a response I didn't want and couldn't have used. Some things belong to the place where they happened and to the person who was there. The week after I got back, I sat with the retirement paperwork on my kitchen table for 2 evenings before I filled it out. Not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to do it deliberately, the way you close something you've held for a long time. Effective end of the following season, which gave me one more spring patrol, one more summer, one more fall close. I slid the paperwork under Gus's door on a Thursday morning without knocking, because I didn't want to have a conversation about it yet, and drove out to the trailhead and sat in the parking lot for a while, looking at the access road gate. Before I drove home, I called Carol, who was Dale's sister, and who I had spoken to exactly once since the memorial. A brief call in the first month where we'd both said the things you say, and then not known what to say after. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Roy. The way she said it, she'd been thinking about the call too. Carol, I've been meaning to call for a while. There was a pause. I know, me too. I don't have anything particular to say, I told her. I just wanted you to know I still go up to the marker. I've been going up for a while now. Another pause. Her voice when she answered was careful, the kind of careful that's covering something full. Thank you for telling me that. It matters. We talked for about 20 minutes about nothing much, her work, the daughter's job, the winter. When we hung up, I sat in the truck for a little while longer and then drove home. I stopped timing my trips to the trailhead to avoid the memorial bench near the parking area. That was the other thing. The district had put a small bench there with Dale's name on a plate, and for 2 years I had managed my arrival and departure times so I would not have to stop at it, or feel obligated to stop, or explain to anyone why I was stopping or why I was not. After the patrol, I stopped arranging my schedule around it. I sat there a few times that winter, in the cold, with Petra alongside, and it turned out to be exactly what it looked like. A bench with a name on it, in a place that was meaningful, and sitting there didn't cost what I had been afraid it would cost. I want to be honest about that. The fear of the ritual had been heavier than the ritual itself. I don't know whether that would have resolved on its own eventually. What I know is that after the patrol, it resolved, and I'm not going to pretend I can't account for why. Spring came late that year. The access road gate didn't come off until the second week of May, and even then the upper trail was navigable only in patches, the snowpack having hung on the north-facing sections until warm nights came back in earnest. I did my last patrol in the spring, my last summer survey, my last fall season. Close. On the last day of my last close patrol, I drove down the access road for the final time as a district employee and stopped the truck at the gate and got out and looked back up at the ridge for a while. Petra sat in the passenger seat and watched me through the window. Then I got back in and we drove to town and I bought us both something from the diner. The morning I am thinking of, the one that belongs specifically to this story, came in the second spring after I retired. I'd been gone from the district long enough that I was no longer tracking the patrol schedule, no longer thinking in terms of trail condition assessments and work orders and weather windows. I was just a person with a truck and a dog and a piece of routine that had outlasted the job it came from. I drove the access road on a morning in early May, the kind of morning where the light is pale gold and the air smells like cold water and new growth both at once. And I parked at the trailhead and clipped Petra's lead, and we walked up to the 4-mile marker. The stone was in morning light, the slope above it still holding some last patches of old snow in the shadows, and the valley below it was green in the low places where the melt had been running for weeks. The thermos was on the stone, not my thermos. Mine was in my pack because I had packed the way I always packed, from habit so deep it doesn't require intention. The thermos on the stone was one I didn't recognize. Dark in color, larger than mine, the stopper fitted correctly, set on the stone the way something is set when the person setting it knows what they're doing. I stood there for a long moment. Petra sat beside me without being told and leaned against my knee, and her breathing was the slow, even breathing of a dog who is comfortable, not alarmed. The upper ridge was clear in the morning light. The hemlock stand above the switchback was exactly what it had always been. Old trees, dark canopy, the kind of stillness that is presence held in rather than absence of anything. I looked up at the tree line for a while. I didn't see anything I could name. I took the thermos from my pack and poured the coffee into the 2 cups I'd started carrying, because old habits break in pieces and some pieces hold, and I set both cups on the stone beside the one I didn't recognize. The steam went up in the cold air, thin and white, and disappeared. I sat down on the ground beside the marker with my back against the stone, and Petra settled across my legs, heavy and warm, the way she does when she's decided we're not going anywhere quickly. The valley was filling with morning. The sky above the ridge was the particular clear blue that only comes after a hard winter, when the air has been scrubbed clean by months of cold, and what's left is something almost transparent. I didn't try to explain what the thermos on the stone was. I'd stopped needing to explain it. I had been a careful man my whole life, careful about what I said I knew, and careful about what I admitted I didn't. That's not a bad way to live, and I'm not saying the patrol changed me into a different person. I'm the same person. I still write things in field notebooks, even though I don't have a district to report to anymore. I still check wind direction before I make camp. I still think in terms of terrain and weather and the behavior of things I can observe directly. What changed is smaller than all of that. What changed is that I no longer think the edge of the tree line is where attention stops. Something out there learned the shape of a man's grief and answered it in kind. I don't know what it was. I've turned it over enough times that I've stopped looking for the category it fits into, because the category isn't the point. The point is that for 2 winters, I walked up to a stone marker and poured out coffee for a man who couldn't drink it, and something in the high country was paying attention, and one November morning, it decided to let me know. Petra shifted her weight on my legs. The coffee in the cups was cooling in the spring air. I left both cups on the stone when I got up to go. Mine and the second one, side by side. The way you leave something for a table that seats more than one.